Chair, and for Debbie inviting me here tonight. I'm thrilled and I'm nervous at the same time. Just in your last words that you spoke, Debbie, about saying I'm going to provide a different perspective or a different worldview is right, and it is exciting for me. I want to encourage people to change that view that we are all stuck with right now. So this is what I'm going to do tonight. So my topic is on logocentrism, the Ptolemy of language. Tonight I'm going to play with a few words, just as a philosopher named Derrida does. And he deconstructs words and written words, the philosophy behind all of that, and challenges people to take different perspectives. So I'd like to apply his philosophy to my lecture tonight and what I've researched, and specifically to sign language. Before we start, you may have noticed when you came in that there was an audio track playing. And this audio track played, it's an 8-minute set, but it probably looped many times while we were preparing to begin. And you might have been wondering, what is that? And I want to know how many of you heard the actual audio track playing. Okay. So first I'd like to explain to the deaf audience, obviously they didn't know the audio track was playing. I have had somebody interpret what they think is on the track, and so I'm going to describe it to you as according to their interpretation. And this repeats over and over again, and then it gets a little bit more intense and becomes more intimate. And then it settles down again. So for 8 minutes that track plays. And maybe I'll show you a video that could reflect that piece or parallels that piece. I'm not quite sure what I need to do here. Can I get some assistance? When I was taking my first year at NSCAD in Nova Scotia, we had to provide or do a presentation, and this is the one that I did, ASL Coughing English ASL. And the quick description to that is ASL changed into sign English, and then it went back to ASL, into poetry form. And it was a live performance. It was very simple performance, not a lot to it, but it had a great impact. There was vocalization that was presented. The audience felt like I was right there with them, but I wasn't. I was quite far away from them. So it was very impactful. I want to show you that performance with the sound. And the sound was actually what you heard on the audio track. So I want to give you an idea of what that performance actually looked like. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. Yeah. in the classroom was done. I was on a white background, the white wall was my backdrop. I wore black clothing, a black mask. Started out using ASL, and poetry in ASL. Then I went into English order, signed English, English, and was very intrusive. It showed in my performance the variation that came out, how the language changed what I wanted to say, how it had an impact on what I was trying to get across. So the idea here is that when you're taught spoken English or signed English, researchers use this over and over again, and children actually went back to ASL, the grammatical aspect of ASL, because that was their natural intuitiveness coming out. In the audio tape, I could see, with the graph that came out with the audiogram, I could see where I changed into English and how non-fluent it was and how just stagnant and jumpy it was. So it definitely had an impact on the sound and the actual performance, the visual part of it. From what I've seen, research that's been done in artwork, in various forms of art, I've seen signs where it says artwork, gesture, and it's a pair of hands. I knew that it would be a pair of hands before I could even see, before I even looked at it. So it seems that people are stuck with the notion that gesture always means something to do with the hands. So I want to discuss the concept of gesture, and I will do that throughout my presentation, but I'll just go back to this a bit. I want to begin with a metaphor. This will be my foundation carrying me through my presentation. So here I have a slip of paper. Here I have another slip of paper. So the Mobius metaphor, there's two different worldviews that play into the Mobius metaphor. We have this view, this piece of paper, and the other one. And what I want to emphasize, the importance is that these two are not opposites. They are different. They are different, they are not opposite. And there's a difference between those two concepts. So I want to make that clear, that they are not opposites. So when I look at this one piece of paper, I say that this is a logocentric view of this piece of paper. It's a way of thinking, a way of framing your world. When I look at the Mobius strip, it's another way of thinking. It's a Euclidean math. And this is mainly what you've learned growing up in school. Math, algebra, all coming from a Euclidean form. There were Greek mathematicians that set up the foundation of mathematics and applied that to the Mobius strip. We could also look at this as being part of the fractal world, where things come together in our pieces. So again, another form of math. Just like if we look at the binary form, the number systems, like pi and phi and all of those different forms, that comes from this view, the same view that the Mobius strip fits into. The logocentric view is more focused on specific criteria, which I will get into. And it's more of a linear approach. Logocentrism seems to will typically look at this and say, oh, there's this and then there's this, and they'll see another view of this. So for example, if you look at the picture on the screen, you see birds. On the other side, you'll see fish, and you'll see them as two separate components. So there's a dichotomy that they automatically set up. With the Mobius strip, the view is very different. They look at the piece as a whole to see what exactly has shaped that bird to be the bird there, and what exactly has shaped the fish to be there. And maybe it's not even just the fish that's there, but it's the whole piece that eludes us to see the fish and to see the bird. So this approach is very much a deconstructionist approach, just like Derrida's approach. So you look at this, you can see the bird, you can see the fish, but you see them both at the same time. You don't see them as separate entities or not together. If I follow this strip with my finger and go around, I see the other side at the same time, all at the same time. So going from one end of the paper around, came from the right side, now it's on the left side. So I call this more of a complementary approach. It's very complementary. I can see both sides, I can see both things happening at the same time. Okay, so this is my metaphor, the foundation that I'm going to start with. So I wanted to just give you one example in showing that. And so how I want to apply that is what you see every day happen. Often you'll see a hearing person approach a deaf person and they'll say, can you lip read? And a deaf person will typically say something, whatever they say. And both views come from the logocentric perspective. What would happen typically, well, a person that I worked with, they asked me, can you lip read? And I looked at them, and I've already looked at the situation in depth, logocentrism and all of that. And right away I picked up on it, and I first said, I answered his question. I said, no, I can do a few words I can pick up, but did you know that hearing people can eye read me? They can eye read my ASL. So that threw this person for a loop. So when they asked me if I could lip read, I thought, what does that mean, lip read? I had to analyze that situation. They're looking at me as I'm a minority. Does that mean that they are the center of the world and that I am the minority and my expectations are that I have to fit your world and I have to work up to your standards? And so what I wanted to do was reverse it. I wanted to deconstruct it and look at it from a different view. So I asked him, can you eye read my ASL? And they were shocked for a minute, and then he said, we are complementary, we need to share, we are diverse, we are different, we are not opposites. So opposites become to me very controlling and not complementary.
So if we can go further on this, looking at a logocentric viewpoint, logos as a term itself, a lexical term itself, the D term looks at reasoning perhaps, logic might be another thing, mathematical, truthfulness, equate to a godly deity thing kind of thing. That all encompasses the term logos. In itself is a foundation, has been a foundation in our kind of historical framework for thousands of years. If you look at the history through time, how it really has taken the center of philosophy, the way we speak, the way we think, and so forth. When we look at that being the center and look outside that, we look at the marginal aspects, the minority and so forth. Again, with logocentrism, remember I spoke earlier about the dichotomy, opposites, for example, male, female, for example, hearing, deaf, night, daytime. Again, that follows particular way of thinking, opposites, dichotomy. We look at metaphysics as well. What's there, what isn't. We look at truth or untruth. The emphasis is always on the opposites when we look at a logocentric viewpoint or hierarchy. So on the list of opposites, as I've shown you with examples of a linear approach versus the Mobius strip complementary approach, there certainly looks very much at a hierarchical approach. A dominance versus non-dominance, center versus marginalization. Complementary, when we look at complementary, we might look at, or supplementary, supplementary, we might look at speech as complete, the ultimate, and then something else as supplementary. The writing would be supplementary if we look at the spectrum of communication. Moving on to my next slide. This photograph of Derrida is a philosopher. Some of you may be familiar, maybe for some of you not so much, but Derrida was trained as a philosopher in his particular discipline. He recently, he passed away in '84 and was a very influential philosopher in his field. And his students have continued his work in literature and philosophy, in particular deconstructing reading and communication. He wasn't in support of a particular discipline, a philosophical bent, but really analyzed it deeper. He would challenge from a different framework, thinking more or less outside the box. If you want to look at it three-dimensionally, looking at it from all angles, looking at a fractal approach, analyzing, deconstructing, and then again constructing, interpreting and reinterpreting, looking at so many different angles. So his philosophy is not one of a linear approach, but more of a complementary approach. So again, the complementary approach really fits with a metaphysical philosophy. And I'm going to use several different metaphors to illustrate the whole point of undecidability. On the flip side, and multiple flip sides, if you will, really examines this viewpoint, how you can use language to position yourself in various points of view. Whether you reinterpret or interpret a particular concept or a schema, looking at multiple fractal points of view rather than a dichotomy, which really looks at two sides. So deconstructing language, deconstructing thought, communication, writing, and so forth, he identified not only just a two-sided point of view, but multiple viewpoints. And that's something that we should consider. When we look at how the whole notion of science and light, particles, as opposed to the whole, other scientists would look at more of an ocular point of view, looking at wavelength or light waves, more at a subatomic level, as opposed to something that's concrete. Again, with science, we're always looking for knowledge and truth, right and wrong. But when you look at wavelength, that is more at subatomic level, more deeper, more complementary approach. And again, very relative to that particular discipline. One philosopher that made an impact on Derrida was Nietzsche. And his comment was, there's no fact, but only interpretation. And I thought about that as a framework looking at science, how scientists look at a particular phenomenon, and how scientists come to a situation with interpretation, reinterpretation, again, reinterpretation. In this particular slide, as I explained to you about logocentrism and logos, truth, honesty, God, logic, setting up a hierarchical framework or a scheme on which to build our understanding of the world, that has certainly had an influence from a foundational point of view of how we even think today and how we live our lives today. From the point of view of God being the top or pinnacle, and then secondary would be thought, tertiary would be speech and language, and then writing, and then on the flip side, sign language. Aristotle, the father of philosophy, mentioned, as many as you know, if there's no speech, there's no thought. So again, that has an impact, especially for deaf people think, well, if I have no speech, then I can't think. Because the whole point of logocentrism is that you must have speech to have thinking and thought. It's very much a hierarchical approach. Dichotomy, again, is a framework of thinking. When we look at ethnic groups or religious groups, being opposed to maybe iconic or pictures in terms of idolatry and worship, when we look at that particular phenomenon, looking at thinking of thought and abstract, one God only, without having symbols or statues to worship, that would represent iconoclasm. There certainly is a struggle, especially with people who are illiterate, who need pictures or symbols to make understanding more part of their world. Certainly over time that has changed. It's less rigid, of course, but when we look at historical events, that wasn't necessarily the case. So we had a viewpoint of iconoclasm, and again, sinoplasm. So with abstract thought, a God that exists, but you cannot see this God. Symbolisms, pictures that represent God was considered iconoclasm. And then that kind of tied into sinoplasm. Because we were always forbidden to use signs or symbols to represent a particular viewpoint or knowledge. So certainly with a visual world, taking in information to make understanding or knowledge is part of a person's comprehension or understanding. Certainly during the Renaissance time, when they invented so many scientific instruments, especially the telescopes and ocular instruments to travel around the world and to look at the planets and so forth, there was more emphasis on scientific knowledge as opposed to the arts of the drama. The focus of society, especially during Renaissance and the scientific age, focused on that. So de-emphasizing the arts, the dramatics during this period. So very much ocular centrism. So what we see now is very much an ocular centrism viewpoint, anti-ocular viewpoint. phonocentrism. Or, that person who's deaf is maybe limited by ability in communicating in English because of their lack of hearing the language.
So in all of the literature that I've read, I have found many, many phonocentric and logocentric views. And maybe one of our projects needs to be to develop one of these books to show all of them, deconstructing, show what we've got and then show how we can deconstruct it. I have picked a few examples to share with you today in a logocentric approach. So some of them are, for example, sign language is a substitute to speech. The other one, in some circumstances, indeed, when speech is unavailable, whether for environmental, ritual, or physiological reasons, gesture can become a form of language all by itself. And this was written by Adam Kendon. And he researched gestures. So if there's no ability to use oral speech, then let's use gesture. And when the history of language went through its changes and the research of language first began, it was not speech, it was gesture used vocally and bodily. But it sounds like gesture can only be used to replace speech. Aristotle's proclamation, I just mentioned that to you. Deaf people cannot reason without hearing. So that's his famous quote. So is speech related to logocentrism, and that it's the center of all? When we look at text, written text, we see the words that describe sounds or art or visual, and the actual pictures that are added to that text is called supplementary to the text, so therefore it's beneath the text. And is it really supplementary? Is that the view that we need to take? So we're forgetting again about the other perspective. Another quote, I didn't put the name down, but an author did say that hearing, of course, is unique among senses in that its medium is also the medium of language. So when we look at all of the senses that we have, the 5 senses that we have, there are other things that do not relate to language. Hearing relates to language, but the other 4 senses do not relate to language at all. Touch is part of language, but so all of those other senses are overlooked. The left cerebral hemisphere is related to speech and language. And into the 1990s, up until the 90s, they believed that speech only came from the left side of the brain, and that if you didn't have that, then you did not have language. And it wasn't until after the 90s that research found different. And if we look at onomatopoeia, we say that the sound represents, or the word represents what we hear, the sound. But really, it can be described differently. Vibrations do not represent sound, but it's interpreted to be sound. Another example might be, I'm just touching the top of the iceberg here, the tip of the iceberg, but there's definitely far more beneath. So I spoke in generality about logocentrism. Now I want to go into a few more specifics And I say few, meaning very few, because there are so many more. So up here on the screen, can I read quickly? And I'll just summarize quickly for you. So again, it's a phonocentrism approach, and there's lots of discussion around this area. And in general, it means that speech is above writing, or above text. And that writing is really not a language, but it's a way of recording somebody else's language. When we look at other philosophers like Plato and Aristotle and Saussure and Levi Strauss, Bloomingfield, there's a list of them. Philosophists, linguists, cultural people who study culture. Writing is absent, it's dead to them. Speech is the be-all, end-all. So the view is definitely there that writing is at the bottom, it's not connected to speech. The oralism is natural, writing is artificial, text is dead. Anything related to writing, like hieroglyphics, or anything that's written, that's developed, symbols or symbology. Phonetics, for example, is close enough to speech, but any other kind of writing like pictography or hieroglyphics or anything is seen to be a lower form. So it just keeps moving down. So again, we come back to that whole hierarchical perspective. And often people will ask deaf people, how is it that you learned to write and read English so fluently without having sound? So as an example, in Nepal, I lived with a man who was retired there, and he was a school principal for many years in education, and he was from England. And we had many discussions, and he's always said to me, you can't hear. How is it that you're so adept in using English? And I tried to say to him that, written language has nothing to do with sound. And he still didn't quite get it. He'd ask me again, a week or two later, again. So I'd go through the same explanation. It still seemed to really bother him, and he was really thinking about it and dissecting it and deconstructing it. So I asked him, well, why are you asking me this? He didn't understand, well, but you can't hear. So how is it that you can read and write? So I said, look, the two of us are communicating using a written format. Is there any sound between the two of us right now? Is there any sound that's participating in the conversation? The communication. And he said, well, no. So I said, you see, sound does not have anything to do with whether or not a person can learn to read and write a language. You learn to read and write language based on academics or your abilities or who teaches you. Language, from a hearing sense, it's sound, it's the grammatic structure. It's visual. The written format is visual. So he didn't quite understand how it is, or how it could be, because his framework was very logocentric. And so it took me explaining to him over and over again to get him to see the other side. So there's two viewpoints, and the metaphor that I shared with you. And it's all very quick here. I'm just giving you the very tip, like I said. So back in medieval times, people believed that Earth was the center of the universe. So, and that we have the sun rotate around the earth. This is what people believed. So if I look at that in parallel to speech being the center of language, as a universal language. So speech is the center of the universe. We have the sun that's worshipped, and the gods that worship the sun and look up to the sun. And that logos now becomes the center of the universe. And over here we will have a blind spot. And in the blind spot, there are others that are in this blind spot. And those are the margins that I spoke of earlier. The minorities, black people, deaf people, blind people, homosexual community, and all of that, the minorities. So the logos were the center of the universe, and the rest of the people, or the rest in the margins, were referred to as the others. I have a video here, or another metaphor too. It's almost like the Zen parable. If you said your cup was overflowing, when you go and you meet a Zen master and you're invited in, you are given your tea, and the master pours the tea, and your cup continues to overflow. And you say, the cup is overflowing, it's overflowing. And he continues to pour. Stop, stop, it's overflowing. And he says, it's overflowing. That's because your mind is full. You need to empty your mind in order to, how can I teach you more if your mind is so full with what you believe to be already? And I just want to go back to one of the slides. If you'll give me a moment. So this slide relates to what I was hoping to get across. I'm sure most of you noticed in this picture the two lovers that are depicted here. And a few of you, or maybe none of you, saw the dolphins. There's one here, if you see the mouse pointer. There's one here. There's a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, seventh, eighth. So there's 8 dolphins in that picture. You can see them now. So the point of this, in relation to what I was just speaking about, was that the logocentric view is very much, from the time we're born until now, it's language, language, language. It's one perspective, one view. You see this and you see that, you don't see the other. You overlook everything else around it, every other particle of it. Some people will see only dolphins in this picture. But if you look at it from the other view, you may not see the lovers, and you may not see the dolphins at all. You may see something completely different. You may only see that it's the shape of a vase, and you might see a profile of somebody. So whether it's a vase, or is it 2 heads put together in the profiles of 2 people. And typically we only see what seems to be the very obvious, what's only the center of what we're looking at, and we ignore the other parts of it, the margins of it. What else is there? What are we missing? And we really don't know what we're looking at, we just see the one view. We only see what we believe is there. So if you're exposed to that and you grow up believing that, as the Zen master says, you need to disconnect, deconstruct, empty your mind, get rid of all of that so that you can see what else might be there.
So we'll turn to this. Synesthesia is a new term I've coined. To give you a background to that, we know of our senses: hearing, taste, smell, touch, sight. All our senses, the 5 senses. We may choose one or the other. It's not interactive, but with research we're finding that's not the case at all. It's very much interactive, all of the senses combined. More depth and more breadth. Think of it as different hues of color. more flavor, more richness in a particular aspect, be it sight, sound, taste, smell, and everything else. It's interactive and it's very much complementary. Wolfgang Kohler did some research on subjects and asked them to look at shapes. Kiki being angular, and Boo being very curvature. 95 to 98% had correct, or not, I should say correct, but matched the angular with Kiki and matched the curvature shapes with Boo. So we're looking at a very high percentage rate. And I'm assuming the subjects we're hearing, but I'm thinking to myself, well, what about deaf people? I would probably fit in the category of being 95 to 98%, so I did some of my own research, and I found that was certainly the case. So synesthesia might be something we could coin today for ourselves with Kiki and Boo. And I thought, let's look at shapes of sign language, especially finger spelling. Angular shapes of some shapes that are finger spelled, be it the written word. I mean, that's what Kohler did. But look at the shapes that deaf people use for finger spelling. Certainly there are some shapes that are angular and some that are soft in shape. So curvature shapes. Even Kiki, like K-I, K-I, match the shapes of the letters. So we can see some parallels to this gentleman's research. Synesthesia, intermodal, very much intermodal. With visual input and synesthesia, again I mentioned intermodal, language being intermodal, interactive, complementary, certainly not linear, certainly not a dichotomy. So that really has an impact on language acquisition. And this is my next slide on this point. In the early 90s, this particular period, at McGill University, one researcher took it upon herself to look at deaf subjects, looking at hemispheric cognitive activity, especially with sign language, with sound and input of sound and output of sound, looking at deaf subjects of input of visual and output of visual, and the brain activity, be it in the left hemisphere, right hemisphere. And it very much matched subjects that were hearing and used spoken language. There is left hemispheric activity, but certainly there is right hemispheric activity. And we know now that even though there's dominance in left, it doesn't supersede or say that if you have speech is only left dominance, it really is intermodal. We look at language, not necessarily the sense of it, be it sound or sight, which is an interesting fact. Furthermore, Newman, again researching particular subjects, particular hearing subjects, bilingual, these subjects are bilingual in ASL and spoken language, all of them hearing, as I said. They were tested in their performance of spoken language, and again they found that it was left dominant without right input. With these subjects, they also tested them on their ASL fluency, and it showed that they had activity in the left as well as the right. So very much a dual activity. They did further research with these subjects, hearing individuals that were prelingual, both in ASL and spoken English, and the other subgroup were prelingual in terms of, or postlingual, that they acquired language later. And part of the area, the angular gyrus in the right hemisphere, was the activity was missing in the post-lingual group, bilingual group, compared to the prelingual, those that had dual access to two languages. So it's interesting to know that from onset of language, say from 0 to 9 months, it's a critical period. So that really changes the whole paradigm, changes the whole centrism of thinking that the left brain is critical for language acquisition, be it at pre and post. Another point that I'd like to touch on very briefly, looking at the ontogeny of language and the research cited. Looking at babbling in children, or babies in particular, vocal babbling. We know that it's important for pre-linguistic development. And looking at it as it applies to ASL, babies that use ASL. And they found that there's manual babbling that very much parallels that of vocal babbling to the T. So with the studies of both groups looking at critical stages, left brain development, right brain development, and looking at babbling, things that are scaffolding over time, over language acquisition, be it vocal babbling and manual babbling, they're critical stages where the brain basically has its own internal time monitor where it just turns on like a switch, be it vocalization or manual babbling. There is an internal switch that the brain controls to turn on the developmental stages. Modality isn't critical, it's internal to the child's timing. So just to continue on with this frame of reference from babbling, I'd like to move on to gesturing. The research that speaks to this area, the books, the literature reviews that I've done, one thing I've noted that kind of has been nagling me, like looking at gestures and pantomimes and emblems and sign language. There's a lot of information or research on gestures. But one thing that I think is missing, especially from my lived experience, certainly my background, Kendon, who I mentioned earlier, kind of established the foundation or the matrix of how people use gestures in sign language. We know from research that indeed sign language is a language. But how do you differentiate gesture and sign language? So he set up an XY matrix, a continuum, as you can see on the slide, gesture, calls, pantomimes, emblems, sign language, and it is very much a continuum. But I feel when I look at it, it doesn't really fit for me. Well, certainly not from my paradigm. So I set up to look at it more in depth and create my own continuum, if you will. I disagree with gestures being equated to manual. I think it's much more than that if you look at it from a deeper level. I think that this viewpoint is very much logocentric. So in dealing with this, or his framework, I wanted to go beyond a more of a complementary viewpoint or schema, if you will. And I have found some literature to support my belief. Gesture and the Nature of Language by Stokey, Wilcox, and Armstrong. Co-authored this book and looked at it, at gesture and sign language from a complementary viewpoint, and not from a dichotomous viewpoint. These authors define gesture as this.
So really there's 3 points under this definition. We have a neuromuscular activity, which is connected to the movements that the body makes. The semiotic, which could be referred to vocal or manual, doesn't matter. So whether parts of the body are moving, and then moving that becomes semiotic and based, there's spontaneous or communicative gestures, more conventional gestures that build up to the grammatical aspect, and then we look at the linguistic part of it. So I think babbling in parallel to the neuromuscular activity, and then as the child's language evolves, they get into they start using gestures, they start using facial expressions, and it's all intermodal. They start using their vocal cords, they start humming, making noises. It goes down through their diaphragm, the tongue starts making the movements, everything starts developing. And then we get to the end where we are linguistically fluent. And both can be seen as parallel to one another, both vocal and the manual approaches to language. Ken didn't have the continuum, which I just showed you. And I looked at his continuum and saw that it focused too much on the gestural aspect versus the manual. So I made some adaptations and I added the vocal and the manual aspect. We have gesticulation, gestures, pantomimes, which is all the phonomatopoeia, what things sound like, how we start to learn language, and then it becomes more abstract. So everything overall in a vocal language at the same time has gesticulation embedded within that language, as does a manual language, incorporates gesticulation as well. They coexist, they are together with the body movements, everything. With language use comes gestures. There are voice gestures that are embedded within the use of vocal language, as there are in the use of manual language. So the word onomatopoeia, let me back up 1 minute before I go on to that. Most people that look at sign language consider it to be a universal language. And I'm not sure why that's an assumption that's out there. And then other people look at it and say sign language is a gestural language. And that really gets to me too. And then you have people who say, oh, it's an iconic language. I say, an iconic language? It is not. And then people say it's a form of miming, which really irks me. So, very logocentric viewpoints. And I'm trying to figure out where that's coming from and why people think that way. And I know that phonocentric and logocentric viewpoints explain their limited knowledge. But when I look at onomatopoeia, what a huge word that is, a very formal word. I look at iconic, and I look at mime, and I look at onomatopoeia. And onomatopoeia, meaning that a spoken word is based on the sound that it represents. Is based on the sound that it represents. If you hear a bird chirping, the word chirp sounds like a bird chirping. When a train goes by and blows its whistle, the toot toot sounds like toot toot. So there's many words in English that are onomatopoeia, and they're strongly iconic. When we say that it's iconic, we think, well, can it be iconic if it's based on sound? But when people say that, oh, this sign for tree, that's gestural, that's miming, that's iconic, is it? I think we've been labeled. I think English and vocal language has very many iconicities in their language. So if we go back to the origin of a word, or the etymology of a word, onomatopoeia, if I look at ono means to name. So onomono means to name something, and pia means to make. So name to make has nothing to do with sound. So I can say this is iconic. No, I'm going to say it's onomatopoeia. My tree, the sign for tree is onomatopoeia. And it represents the concreteness of the language. So then what I decided to do was put a little bit of play on words and say phonomatopoeia is there for phonetic language, so why don't we look at visual language and say visual matopoeia? It's very, very related to thought and the power of thought that has over language. When we look at our thoughts, our values, our beliefs, can we deconstruct and say it's the language? Language is very powerful. It very much comes from our thought. There's no disconnection. It's no, in reality, we see the world and we see it in very many different perspectives, and it's all encompassing within us. So back to the model that I came up with, or that I propose, which is a more complementary view, and I've explained that recently. So if we look at the lower half of the model, people who use a vocal language also have voice paralinguistic features that include gesture. And if we look at a manual language and incorporate the gestures that the manual language has and put them together, if we say that language only comes from our vocal tract, only comes from, it comes from our body, it comes from everything about us, everything that makes us who we are. We only seem to focus on the vocal tract, we only seem to focus on the diaphragm. We don't look at the rest of the body as being part of how we use language and how we perform language. So deaf people use a manual language, and incorporated in that is manual gestures. And then all of those movements with the gestures and the everything becomes a language, just as much as what you see coming from sound, the language that comes from the diaphragm up your, into your vocal tracts and out. It's all the same thing. I call the sounds nothing related to language, but more so related to gesture. It comes through the body, it's vibrated through the body, it's gesture in light, in form. Just like the audio clip that I played earlier, with the mask over top of my face, but making the noises, it sounded like somebody was being intimate with each other, but it all was just sound. In formal times, people like the aristocrat groups, people talked very snobbish, and if you used sign, you were an animal. You were considered very beneath them. You were, it was not appropriate. It was unacceptable. But today we don't see that happening in our society. We see people who are using spoken language, manual language, either language, showing the gestures in full force. But deaf people are forced to turn their vocal tracks off, their vocal gestures, if you will, off, because it's too animal-like. So there are those two parallels between the gestures, between both languages, or both forms of language. And many interpreters said that it's impossible, that's why they say it's impossible, to do both languages at the same time. You can't do ASL and English at the same time and have it make the same sense. Which I say, okay, that's fine. But is it possible to have this particular model that I'm proposing? Maybe if we looked at another culture, another origin of language, another evolution of language, of a newborn baby that could learn how to speak and sign at the same time, or another grammatical language that's something completely aside from ASL or English, in another world. It could happen. It's not impossible, it's possible. And again, I'm coming back from the complementary model, that D view that I spoke of at the beginning. Let's look at terminology. Let's look at the word deaf, sign language, American Sign Language. I started to deconstruct through that as well, thinking about the logocentric viewpoints. And then I decided to go to the other viewpoints and wanted to throw some things at you here. Let's look at the word deaf. Right away, we think cultural, language. We know what we see, what we know by the word deaf. But traditionally, like if you look in the dictionary, the word deaf says cannot hear, does not hear. That's the definition of the word deaf. So I deconstructed that word, meaning deaf, cannot hear. So very much an autist approach, an autism. So if we, as a deaf person, do use the word deaf, are we taking that approach? Are we autists? And some of us might be, and some of us might not be. Remember at the beginning of tonight's lecture, I said I wanted to explain to the deaf audience, the deaf members of the audience, the audio tract. Now that doesn't mean I was coming from an autist point of view, but if a hearing person came up to me and said, "Hi, how are you?" and I point to my ear and gesture that I can't hear and say I'm deaf, is that autist? Am I coming from an autism perspective? So I don't fit your world, I can't function in your world, I'm beneath you, I'm the minority, you are the center of the universe, I'm the margin. And I'm trying to fit into that attitude, right? So do I become then the logocentrist person as well? So I say, I'm sorry, I'm deaf, I can't hear, and they say, oh, okay, and they turn around and they leave. So everything seems to be repeating itself, this cycle back and forth, over and over again, and the choices are limited. We do have choices though. We can crack the autism. That was, you saw that piece that I developed. Speak in ASL, those videos I think I made about 6 years ago. There was some other ones where I actually really went to myself and tried to figure out what did these things mean to me. So if I call myself deaf, this is what I get. But what if I call myself Amazlan? What would happen? So hearing people would come up to me and talk, and I would literally sign back to them, I'm sorry, I cannot understand you, I do not speak English. So this would be what I'd say in sign language. And they would stand there and stare at me. And so I've done that for 6 years, and I've noticed a huge difference in people's behavior. So when they come to me and they start speaking, I start signing. If I say I'm Amazlan, I'm not deaf, I'm Amazlan. I start signing to them and focusing on the language instead of my deafness. Let's take that focus instead of the focus of the logocentrism. So to show them that I express in a different language, I communicate in a different language, I use a different modality. And this person or whomever I communicate with understands that I'm the same, I'm just different. So I wanted to show this complementarism between the two of us, change their logocentric viewpoint, see if it could become more complementary. If I signed versus just saying, gesturing that I'm deaf and I can't hear, it was less threatening. It was, if I said, you know, it was self-defeating for me. It was self-deflating. I was taking away from myself. I got more respect signing to this person or to a hearing person that spoke to me than I did when I said, I'm sorry, I'm deaf, I can't hear you. And they tried to continue to communicate with me. So conversation and communication actually took place, whereas before, they would just turn around and walk away. When I was on an airplane before, I used to make my little note to the airline attendant and say, apple juice, no ice, apple juice, no ice. I'd have it ready before I even got on the plane. So one day I decided I'm going to order using sign language, using my language, and if they don't get it, they can get a pen and paper themselves. And so I wasn't trying to be, you know, aggressive or anything, but what I wanted to do was make a connection and show this person that I could communicate with them. And I read me. They said, you know, I said I want apple juice, and I think in my head, was it a challenge for them? What if I said no ice? Will they get it? But they did, they got it. The first time I said it, it happened and there was no problem. So I was being authentic to myself and to my language. I did it again the second time I flew, and continue to do it to this day. So I started to think about why is it or how is it that they're catching on to what I'm saying. And it goes back to that whole synesthesia. Remember I spoke about that earlier in the senses, and the same thing with the whole kiki and boob. They see three movements. They see the shapes of the letters, or the shapes that I'm showing. They see the letter I, they see the letter C, they see the E. They're reading my eyes. They're catching on. And I'm gaining the respect, and I'm giving the respect, and it is complementary, and we are in the same world. And there is no expectations for me to always meet or fit that world, the center of the universe, but now it's comparable, and we both meet each other. The logocentric view, again, is very hierarchical. It's very dominant. They have the power, the control. I need to fit into their world, and so I always feel like I'm beneath them. They're the center of the universe, I'm the margin, I'm in the margins. When I start signing, I begin to develop my own center. They have their center, and I develop my own center. So again, I become authentic to who I am in this world and who they are in this world. There are no opposites, there is no dichotomy. If we focus on the language, and we focus on the diversity, then focusing on the difference between hearing and deaf, I guess if we look at difference and diversity versus opposites or anything else, then we will be better off.
In other countries, there's different ways of expressing unable to hear or loss of hearing, which has led me to think about deconstructing myself and my language. It's not a universal language. That's certainly, when we say universal language, it's very much coming from a logocentric point of view. if you look at different countries and the sign languages of different countries, they're different. It's diversity based on identity and people that use the sign languages from a logocentric perspective. Especially what's happening now with cochlear implants in Ontario, the medical practitioners and those involved in that field are actually forbidding the use of ASL when they're implanted. And yet, how odd is it when we know that there are people out there, there's a movement of having hearing babies learn sign language. You know, they're saying, well, it's going to boost their linguistic performance or their fluency, and there's such a movement in that area, and yet with deaf babies that are implanted, they're not allowed to use ASL. Now, isn't that logocentric? What we need to look at is, you know, not looking at the disability. Say, for example, in this case, deaf, and then linguistic ability secondary. We need to change this paradigm and look at it as linguistic proficiency and fluency foremost, and deafness secondary perhaps. And then everybody has the right to choose regarding the modality or their preference. Again, looking at linguistic rights first and foremost, regardless of their perspective on them being deaf, their deaf identity, what have you. So when we look at the case of implanted children and exposure to language, they could have exposure in ASL or spoken language. That would be the option parents would provide for their child. It's a linguistic right. So again, that linguistic right foremost, and less of a pathological viewpoint or an oddist viewpoint. I'm sort of going to summarize my presentation now. This particular quote on my overhead. This quote by Tully wrote a book called No Full Stops in India. And this narrative looks at how the British imperialistic society really destroyed Indian culture, the language. It really caused mayhem, and that particular quote really made an impact on me. It has often been said that if you want to destroy a people, first destroy its language. And I thought about this in my particular context, especially the examples of meeting many hearing people in my travels. It's not that if you want to destroy a language, you have to destroy yourself first. You feel so, not destroying myself, but destroying my language. I say, like, I'm sorry, this is my language, I don't understand your spoken language. It's the language. I need my language to make me feel good, to have that self-worth and self-respect, and not to be deprecated by others. It's much more than that. It's not about my ability to hear or not hear, and being exposed to a pathological viewpoint, especially in education. If I don't speak well, then I don't think, or I'm not able to converse. I'm very much disempowered. That was the viewpoint that I've been exposed through, and certainly from my experience as a child up to adulthood. Another lived example, again back on the plane. It certainly happens on the plane, but I was in the passenger waiting room area, and somebody was saying something to me, and I signed back to that person, and I just said, basically, sorry, I don't understand you in my sign language. And I saved the last line, I just wanted him to figure out what I was saying to him. But I did say to him, could you write something down? So he figured it out just based on my signing of writing on paper, and He got it, I got it. He took out something out of his briefcase. I noticed that he took out a laptop, and then he was typing something on the laptop. I didn't think much of it, but when I looked over, I noticed that he was using WordPad, and I looked over on his laptop, and he started communicating with me. We had a wonderful conversation back and forth. So again, just by changing my perspective from using one of the complementary framework, we had a great conversation. Another plain story. There was someone that was trying to get my attention and talk to me. I kind of ignored that person, but I had to meet up in a lineup, and there was this gentleman that was trying to speak to me in the lineup, and I was kind of rude and didn't really respond. But it was interesting. I wanted to know if he was going to continue talking to me, and I thought, well, here I was sitting close by, and he spoke to me, and I started signing. And he had a pager, and we paged back and forth, and had, a really cool conversation. And this didn't happen previous to my framework until I changed it, and then we had a really engaging conversation. So he shared his world, I shared mine. So when we look at deconstructing other terms, there are many. I just sort of gleaned a few for you. One from a logocentric viewpoint, and then the other from a complementary viewpoint. I do have a list of lexical terms that we use, and I've used many, just to parole, tongue, speak, orate, vowel, logos, voice, etc. These are the words that came up for when I looked at the definition again from a logocentric viewpoint. Not so much on the word sign or sign language, but it seems to me that we need to look at how we get our information, again, the information from a logocentric viewpoint. You know, there's sign and there's ASL, and not much to describe it or other synonyms. But it really is time to deconstruct the information that we get from the world around us. Signing isn't just signing per se, there's much more to describe it. Again, we can see so many parts to the whole when we look at language and the different ways that language is used intermodally. So it's time to do some more research, perhaps sign literature. I think I missed something else. I need to backtrack. The word deaf in Amsland, maybe deaf coming from a logocentristic point of view, doesn't mean I'm going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I don't mean to get rid of it, but let's look where it's coming from and the context in which it's used, from a centric and then from a marginal point of view, those that are involved nonetheless. In my discussions, the word deaf, culture, and everything related to it, we can look at it from deafhood point of view. Not from a word deafness point of view, but much more from deafhood, from a very much a cultural ethno aspect. And Amsland is more focused on the language itself. With ASL, we've used ASL in our teachings and through the community, but last year, again with my research and thesis, I began to find in my reviews the difference between ASL and Amsland. I knew that some time back. Amsland was quite popular, and then it sort of lost touch. I'm not too sure if ASL was easier to use in communicating. But I began to note that it certainly came from a hierarchical, logocentric viewpoint. Very much a dichotomy when we look at ASL and the opposite. ASL being American Sign Language, and then other languages, German Sign Language, French Sign Language. It didn't sit well with me. With more thought, I considered it very much a hierarchical point of view. They never said French speech language or German speech language in the acronym. How do I identify ASL with the people that use the language? What about the people themselves that use the language? Again, to that quote, Tully's point, if you destroy the language, you destroy the people. If we destroy the word deaf, it will destroy the identity of deaf people. So Amazon is related to deaf people and the language. It really ties them very well together, from my perspective. So again, I'm dealing with this as AMSLAN. In Australia, they have AUSLAN, Australian Sign Language. So again, using their experience, we could perhaps use AMSLAN to continue that as part of our identity, as part of our culture and deafhood. Again, from a deconstructivist viewpoint, think about how the use of that particular word affects us as deaf people. So I'm moving back and I'm moving forward. But before we say, oh yeah, use AMSLAN or ASL as a beautiful language and talk about it in that way, let's understand, let's backtrack a little bit and look at and deconstruct where it has come from and then how it has affected our frame of thought, the way we think of the world, the way we think of ourselves. What do we emphasize with sign language? Do we emphasize sign, or do we put more emphasis on language? We look at sign language and the hierarchy as something beneath spoken language, or manual visual language. Even manual visual language is associated with sign language. Consistently you see that, or it's referenced in literature. ASL is a language used by visual language modality, or that's the emphasis. That's more emphasizing the language in the hierarchy. ASL is indeed a language. I'm looking at it from a holistic point of view rather than from a part of a whole. Again, that Mobius strip, you can't separate the part from the whole or the whole from the part. It's like focusing holistically to identify who that is and how it's identified to a particular cultural group or deaf identity, deafhood, rather than focusing on the modality. If you want to specify, then yes, of course, you can specify sign language or spoken language, or regardless of whatever language is being used in the context that the person uses it. How does that impact the way we think, in our writing, in our conversations, in the different ways we interact with people? Again, it depends on how it's being used in the context. When we look at signs and words, we look at the concept or examine it closely. Different languages that use these words. The way it's used orthographically, be it Chinese character or Roman alphabet system. Do we focus on the modality first and foremost, or do we look at language? Where is our emphasis? Where is our locus of control or logocentrism? Again, so do we look at the modality? when we look at the word sign or see this sign, we look at the shape and the movement and the orientation. What about ASL and the words that are used? Do we look at the concept or the word? Or is it interchangeable? What viewpoint do you come from when you approach that word or when you come to understand that word or concept? What is comprehensible to you? Is it the output or the input? I guess my point is, do we come from a holistic viewpoint, a complementary viewpoint, or a logocentric viewpoint? Typically, in our history, we say that we focus more on the modality and less on the linguistic identity.
As I said earlier, we talked about the margins, and I said the margins consist of the minorities. And what is the center? Where do people fit in the center? And why are the minorities on the margins? And that's a logocentric viewpoint. We need to remove that viewpoint. We need to emphasize that there is diversity, regardless of size, shape, color, diversity in all of us. We all have individual rights. And for example, if we look at the world and we look at the whole, typically we see people with dark skin being called the minority group. And I found something very interesting. An interpreter that I know who herself is also of dark skin. She calls herself black, and somebody called her that she's in the minority group. And she took great offense to this. We know that the world is majority white people, but there are the high percentage of, the white population is a very small percentage of the population of the world. And so how can we say that she was of the minority? And so her point was, while working on my master's, there was a student in a design program, and he was designing some type of project, and we had a huge discussion about deaf people and literacy needs. So when he went to defend his thesis, I challenged him over and over and over again. And his one sentence was, well, deaf people are the minority. They need to fit into the hearing world. And he said this over and over and over again. And so I wanted to say, well, what are your other options? What other things are you looking at? If somebody's taller than me and I'm short, does that mean he's powerful and I'm the minority and I'm weaker? I couldn't quite figure out where he was coming from. So minority is powerful. If we look at the percentage of people in the world, the population, minority can be very powerful. Minority is a word. It's a word that's used to label groups of people. So again, I'm going back to the whole idea of emphasizing the words that we're using. When we look at language, we all have a language, we all use a language. Let's not emphasize the word sign or the word this. And consider dominance and control. Consider all kinds of things that are happening around you at the same time. Consider that viewpoint of complementary over logocentrism. And looking at baby sign language, again, I'm saying that that's an attitudinal approach. Baby sign language. We don't say that babies have baby spoken language. We don't say babies learning spoken language. So again, what's the emphasis there? They're learning language. We could say the baby is talking in ASL, and the baby is learning to talk in ASL. The baby is learning to talk in English. But we don't say that we're teaching the baby speech language. So the emphasis again on that word, whether it should be there or shouldn't be there, maybe we need to come out with a different way of looking at it. So my point is to be careful about how you use those words and to avoid that hierarchical approach. And again, labeling who's in the whole or in the center and who's in the margins. And where do we set the boundaries? What's normal, what's not normal, what's disabled, what's not disabled? We've already got those dichotomies set up for us. Why not say we have abled services? Abled services applies to anybody. For example, if you go into an organization or an abled service, you need glasses, you need laptops, you need this, you need that. Everybody needs those things. It's abled services. It's to enable you to do something that you couldn't otherwise do without it. Some people have, for whatever reason, services. There's abled services in the university that I was attending. Students who got headaches from writing were able to have services with using a laptop. So again, where's the focus? We all need certain things to do specific things. What defines a disability or a non-disabled person or a normal versus non-normal? Let's play with those words, let's dissect them, let's break them down, and let's not use them. So in closing, if we went way back in time and met Aristotle and all of those other philosophers, Plato and the like, all of those people who thought like-mindedly, and we changed their thoughts to Derrida, to Derrida, I wonder what our world would look like today. I wonder what we would be experiencing. It would be hugely different. So I'll leave that to your imagination. And I will close my presentation with that. Thank you very much for being
here. And whether you agree with me or disagree with me, it's really just food for thought. I want you to think about it, check it out, check my website. I want to hear your ideas. Please let me know. And I'm not afraid if you disagree with me. I like that. Let's have a discussion. Thank you. Thank you, Jolanta. Now I would like to invite another woman of action to respond to tonight's lecture, Linda Cundy. Thank you, Deb Russell, for inviting me and giving me the honor today to respond to Jolanta's presentation. How do I respond? What a wonderful, interesting way to spend our Thursday evening. We're watching your presentation, Jolanta. Sitting and watching Jolanta present her fresh perspectives on issues related to deafhood. Take note that I use the word deafhood as opposed to deafness. The word deafness is related to not able to hear. We are in a neo-movement in which deaf people all over the world are taking charge of their own lives instead of allowing others to take care of us. And that is what the term deafhood is all about. It is a process of identifying and promoting our being as deaf individuals. Just like other terms, childhood, parenthood, childhood refers to the process of being, the process of a child growing up. Or parenthood, the process of being a parent or raising your children. That is why I use deafhood, and it applies to us in our community and identifies us with who we are instead of deafness. it is deaf put. Jolanta is right in the smack of the neo movement. Her thoughts, her feelings about logocentrism, phonocentrism, sinoplasm, they're not new thoughts. But the terms are new. Again, those terms that she presented to us tonight, logocentrism, phonocentrism, sinoplasm. She used them again and again this evening, and I kept watching her and noticed how often she used them. I was fascinated by how natural they were. I was able to figure out quite a few of the meanings through your explanation and background information you gave us. I just have other points that I wanted to add as well. In regards to her stories on the airplane, when she gave us those examples, I was able to tie it to phonocentrism and realize, so that's what the meaning is. And I've had the same experiences. When I went to Geneva from Toronto, and from Geneva to Turkey, I took that trip about 2 or 3 years ago. I had a woman who was a passenger next to me. Her home was Geneva, and she was returning. Her husband and my husband and I were signing to each other. And she was reading a book, but she kept looking at me over and over again. I was thinking, So she took out a piece of paper and wrote, "Is that Braille?" So this presentation this evening had deep impact to me. Her feelings, her ideas, help us believe and think about how deaf people's experiences in a negative sense, how we've been impacted all this time. And now we have the reasons why. The terms that she used, the attitudes, the behaviors, the systematic barriers and discrimination that we face every day based on language and logocentrism. This is a fresh breath, or a breath of fresh air that Jolanta is filling into us today. I am very proud of Jolanta. I have seen Jolanta grow from a young child ever since she moved here from Poland. And are your parents here this evening? No, they're on the cruise. Oh, well, that's bad. Her parents are deaf. Her parents moved here from Poland as newcomers to this country, brought their daughter, and we are so proud of who you have become, Jolanta, through the support and through the mentorship of your parents to be who you are today. Becoming a strong advocate of the deaf community. This is our destiny. As she leads us, we behind her support her and her ideas. And perhaps this is her start at a breakthrough of breaking down the barriers. And our involvement depends on us and depends on you individually or collectively as a whole. I want to thank Jolanta for sharing her bold thoughts and her feelings. Sharing with us her strong desire for a well overdue change in deaf education. So let me open the evening up. We only have 5 minutes for question and answer period. Sorry, you'll have to wait your turn. I have 2 questions myself. My first question is very simple. It's not a complicated question. Not as complicated as her presentation. I have a simple question to ask, and the first one is, when exactly, at what age, did you realize that you had the innate ability to become an artist? In connection with the second question, what or who was your greatest influence that led you to become an artist? So those are my questions, and then Dr. Dave Mason, it's your turn. Those are simple questions. I don't know if I can answer, but they're tough to answer. In regards to my experience with art and as an artist, I go back to philosophy and then to language. Growing up, I was fascinated with language and philosophy of language, which got me to write quite a bit, which led me to art. And when I say art, I'm not talking about pictures and drawings and whatnot. Art in terms of language, in terms of the use of language to express ourselves. There is not one mode of expressing ourselves through art, be it video or painting or drawing. There are many ways to express ourselves and be artists. There are multiple levels of creativity. I believe art and language are intrinsic to one another. This is actually a question that is related to another workshop that I had presented on, and the theme was very different than today's theme. It was in relation to art. Art itself does have a philosophy behind it, and it has language embedded in it, and this is how we express ourselves through the language of art. Be it again in whatever modality that you want to use. If it's words, if it's videotape, if it's a collage, like I showed you my clip, ASL, Coughing English, ASL, that was a mixture of a lot of things, and that's where I express myself. I suppose it was a simple question, but I don't know if I had enough time to give you an appropriate answer. I hope that answered it. What was the second one? Innate. It is innate. Because of the language and the love of because of my love for the language, I am artistic. My question, my feelings and my response to your presentation is very similar to Linda Cuddy's. I was inspired by your work, and you are a leader, obviously, in our community. I'm wondering, in the places that you have been to, if you have developed a curriculum, or if you've developed a course where you can actually teach this information, and if you haven't, I suggest you do so. This is information people should know. We hear the same information year after year. We need the new challenges out there, the fresh look, the fresh perspective, the bold moves that you are moving forward with and what you're proposing with. I suggest you develop a curriculum, you develop a course to teach these perspectives out there and see what comes out of it, to see the impact that you may have in the larger world. That's my suggestion. Really all I needed to say was that I really enjoyed being here this evening and to parallel the comments that have already been made by Linda. I think that the impact that you can have on deaf education and on deaf children would be profound. I'd like to congratulate you to everything that you've done. Thank you for your suggestions and your comments. I have already developed a rough curriculum, a rough idea, a course outline at the university level. I don't know what's going to happen with it. It's filed for now, but thank you for the suggestion again, because I think it's rekindled some fire, and I would seriously reconsider taking out those files and looking at it more seriously and fleshing things out. And I'm sure there are many people out here that are willing to support your work. that would be more than happy to support your findings in the research.
I'm not your opposite, I'm different, that's all.
I wanted to talk in regards to your comments about the word sign and signed language. So I would like to know exactly what you meant by that. That's a very good question. Who picked that word? Who came up with the word and the label of sign language? Was it not deaf people, or were they not involved in that discussion? What is the meaning of sign, the word sign, S-I-G-N? That's a really good question. And if I could just add a couple thoughts. Now, where were my thoughts? Shoot, I just had them. Oh, here they are. When I talk about visual and manual language, we're looking at modality of language. That's all. Specifically, when we say sign or speech, sign is in reference to our manually expressed language versus using our vocal cords or using our speech to say language. I think we have to consider the use of language itself. In Germany, for example, sign language is called Japan, interpreter error. In Japan, sign language is actually called hand language. So let's get rid of the sign and let's get rid of the hand. It's just a language. When we focus on the sign part of it, we're looking at the modality of it. The etiology. It's interesting that sign is actually originally spelled S-I-G-N-T, and it's lost that E as we've gone. Presently, we spell it S-I-G-N. Thank you very much for the questions, and thank you very much for your talk, for your lecture, Jolanta. I'd like to welcome everybody to join us I'd like to thank everyone that joined us this evening. And we welcome everyone for a social and light refreshments after tonight. This is a small little gift for you. One of the researchers in England called an interpreter a lip speaker. Which is very interesting as well, focusing on the lips. So I've just added that to your repertoire of words to deconstruct. Thank you so much for your lecture. We've really enjoyed it. Linda Cunny, thank you for your lovely presentation and comments. If there are any more questions, we can continue elsewhere at the social behind us. I really enjoyed presenting the information. Thank you very much for being here in attendance. I look forward to talking to you one-on-one. And the last announcement that I have for tonight is the next presenter that we have booked is Dr. Stéphane Pirot for the next PCOP lecture. He is from Montreal and Quebec. And he's now living and working here in Alberta. He will be presenting in January in relation to his research in deaf communities in Quebec and the development of. Thank you very much.